Okay, so welcome to week 12 of Anatomy and Physiology. My name is Simon Moss. I'm actually a psychology lecturer, and I'll be discussing special senses today. Now, by special senses, that probably sounds more exciting than it really is. But special senses doesn't involve things like being able to see through walls or being able to read other people's minds. Instead, when we say special senses, we simply mean that we're interested in vision, taste, smell, hearing, and equilibrium, as opposed to touch, which is a much more of what we call a general sense, because it entails many different types of receptors. We might think of touch as one sense, but actually involves being sensitive to heat and cold and pain and many other different types of senses. So in particular, today we're going to be focusing mainly on the anatomy of the eye. In particular, the eye is obviously just a small sphere, and you can only see about a sixth of its surface. And it's enclosed by a fat cushion and bony orbit. But more importantly, it comprises essentially the eyeball, all the structures, the retina, the lens, and so forth, as well as a whole series of what we call accessory structures, which I'll describe now. And the accessory structures just are the eyebrow, the eyelids, the conjunctiva, which is basically a membrane, the lacrimal apparatus, which is basically our tears system, a system for creating tears, and the eye muscles themselves. So let me discuss each in turn. Okay. So here's a picture of the eyebrow, the eyelid, eyelashes. Nothing too interesting there. There's something here called the parabral fissure, which is really just the gap between the top and the bottom eyelids. And parabral is actually just our eyelid, which I'll clarify soon. It's also got what we call the commissures, the lateral commissure and the medial commissure, which is really just a complex word for corner. So lateral commissure means sort of the outer corner of our eye. The medial commissure is the inner corner of our eye. We have our iris, the colour, the eyelid, the pupil, the black spot. There's a sclera, which we'll talk about later, a lacrimal punctum, which we'll also talk about later as well. So let me discuss each of these main accessory structures. So the eyebrows are just the hair above the eye, the oval eye, the separate orbital margins of the skull, and they're designed primarily to shade our eyes from sunlight and prevent perspiration from reaching and distorting our vision. More importantly and more complex is our actually eyelids, and another word for eyelids is palpebrae. Now, I should also mention that what I'll present soon in LearnLine is a document that provides a whole lot of other interesting information you can use. And this document also includes a whole series of mnemonics, which are memory techniques that we can utilize to remember some of these words. So, for example, the way I remember eyelid is I think of, or palpebrae, is I think of, it sounds like a pal with a pea brain, palpebrae, pal with a pea brain, and most pals with pea brains are very strong in that they can open lids well. Okay, so the palpebrae is our eyelid. It's basically just a skin-covered fold that protects the front of the eye, and it meets at those corners of the eye, of course. And right at the inner corner is the lacrimal caruncle, which basically contains glands that produce sweat and oil. And the way I try to remember that is caruncle sounds a bit like criminal uncle. And a criminal uncle is someone who probably sells snake oil and other inappropriate goods. So criminal uncle, caruncle, produces oils like snake oil. And to remember lacrimal, well, lacrimal is just tears. And it sounds a little bit like lacrime. Lacrimal, lacrime, and tears are basically like a cream. So in the actual eyelids themselves are what we call tarsal plates. And these are basically connective tissue within the actual folds of our lids. And there's two different muscles, one that opens the lids and ones that close the lids as specified here. Now the eyelids actually blink every 3 to 7 seconds, and that's designed to remove any foreign objects and to actually moisten the eyes by usually spreading the tears across the eye. Interesting, right at the bottom of our eyelashes are these nerve endings. So not so much at the lashes, but actually at the follicles themselves are actually nerve endings. And they're designed to initiate blinking, right? It says initiative, which should say initiates blinking. So essentially what can happen is if anything is just in the eyes, even just a puff of air in the eyes will activate these little nerve endings, these little nerves right at the end of our follicles here. And that creates a reflex that will initiate blinking to protect the eye. Now, interestingly, also inside these these tarsal areas, these little connective tissue, are what are called tarsal glands. And these little glands actually within the eyelids to produce some sort of oily secretion that partly designed to prevent the eyelids from sticking together. In addition, there's also glands right at the follicles of our eyelashes, right at the ends of our eyelashes, well, where the eyelashes emanate, called ciliary glands. And I'm going to refer to this distinction between tarsal gland and ciliary gland later, because they actually differentiate a couple of disorders. Okay. So here's a picture of some of the issues I've been talking about. Here are these two muscles that, the levator pulveri superior muscle and the orbicularis muscles that actually open and close the eyelids. We've got the eyebrows, we've got the tarsal plate I mentioned, which is that connective tissue within the eyelids. Then we've got a few things like conjunctiva here, conjunctiva sac, which I won't talk about until a moment later. But everything else we've sort of mentioned very briefly. Okay. So what are the conjunctiva? Well, the conjunctiva are basically just a sort of a membrane on the outer of our eyelids and our eyeballs themselves. They're a mucous membrane. So you've got this sort of membrane, like a covering within our eyelids themselves, and also a covering over our eyeball. So the covering over our eyelids is called the palpebral conjunctiva, palpebral meaning eyelid, of course, and the cover over our eyeball is called the bulbar conjunctiva. And the space between the lids and the eye is the conjunctival sac. Now, I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but you can see there's this sort of space between the bottom of the eyelid here and the eye, and we call that the conjunctival sac. Let's now talk a little bit about the lacrimal system, the tear system. Okay. And it's quite interesting, actually. So you have this lacrimal gland here, which is sort of just above the eye. So what actually produces the tears is a gland here above and to the sort of lateral side of the eye. And I'm not so sure if you're sort of aware of that. Some people might think that the gland that produces tears is sort of the sort of inside close to our eye, but it's actually above our eye here. And it produces tears sort of washed over the eye here by blinking. And then sometimes it'll run down our face, of course, if there's a lot of tears, but it also can run inside these little openings here. Sometimes people aren't aware of these small little openings that are open to the external world. The tears can sort of run down here. And these openings are called the lacrimal punctum, and these little ducts here are called the lacrimal caniculus. And they sort of run into a long duct, the nasolacrimal duct, ultimately into our nostrils. And there's some interesting facts that can help you really understand how that can work. So, for example, if we're crying quite a lot, right, although some of the tears will wash down our face, you'll also find that the tears will then enter the ducts, this punctum, and eventually find themselves into our nose. And so our nose starts dribbling. And so that's one of the reasons why when we cry, there's also sort of dribble that comes from our nose. And even when we try everything to sort of hide our tears, we'll still get this sort of wash of mucus down our nostrils. In addition, also quite interestingly, if we're experiencing a cold, then there's often inflammation in the nose, but also in the ducts. And these ducts actually become blocked. This nasolacrimal duct becomes blocked. And so the tears can't as easily rush down our nose, and instead sort of build up in our eyes. And that's why our eyes often water quite dramatically when we actually have a cold. Okay, so this slide here basically just summarizes what I was saying before. The lacrimal gland produces tears or lacrimal secretion. These tears are basically mucus that contains also some antibodies and antibacterial lysosome to protect the eye. Everything else I've covered. And so finally with the accessories are the extrinsic eye muscles themselves. And there's actually 6 different sets of eye muscles that control sort of the movement of our eyeball. This is probably a better slide of that. So essentially you've got this set on the top, bottom, and the 2 sides of the eyes. And they're like the superior, inferior, medial, and lateral rectus muscles. So superior the top, inferior the bottom, medial is sort of the on the side on one side, lateral is the outer side. And they sort of control the eyeball. And then you've got these two oblique muscles that just get the eyeball in the right position. So I can summarize that a bit further on. I mean, it is just another view of how they all work. But essentially, the activity of these 6 muscles is summarized in this table here. All right, so you've got these 4 rectus muscles that move the eye laterally, medially, up and down. But because the superior and inferior ones sort of move it both up, but also like medially, like towards the center a bit, you've got these 2 oblique muscles that sort of move it back out again, just to make sure that when it's moving up and down, it's still staying in the right position. So that's sort of basically why, roughly speaking, there are 6 different eye muscles, actually controlled by a range of different cranial nerves. Okay. And so, with that aside, I can sort of highlight a couple of sort of common eye problems that people experience with these particular accessories. So, for example, I mentioned before that in the eyelids is a particular gland called the tarsal gland, and when this gland is inflamed, it creates a swelling, as you can see here on the top left corner, called a chalazion. Whereas when the gland, these ciliary glands, so there's these glands just at the follicles of our lashes is inflamed, it also creates a bit of a swelling, a smaller swelling usually, that can create discomfort, called a sty. And the way you can remember that, and just to remind you, I've got all these sort of reminders in another document that I'll have online soon, but the way you can remember that is to think that, imagine the bedroom of teenagers, and teenagers are often chilled and lazy, like chalazion, and their bedrooms often resemble sties, like as in pigsties. Okay? So chalazion, or chilled and lazy, and sties. And because their bedrooms often resemble sties, it often inflames their sweaty parents who have to clean the room. And that's just a reminder that these particular glands, they're basically sweat glands, and that when inflamed, create these problems. Whereas inflammation of the conjunctivus, that sort of membranes across the eye, across the eyelids, called conjunctivitis. And pink eye, where the eye actually becomes quite pink, is an example of conjunctival infection. A couple of other problems I should mention. One is called diplomia, which is basically double vision. And that's when you've got the external muscles of the 2 eyes aren't perfectly coordinated. So they're not quite looking at the same spot, and they're not quite working. So you get this vision, a bit like what this photograph, it's quite an eerie photograph on the right-hand side to watch. And finally, the disorder is strabismus. It's not really a disorder, but a common tendency, which is basically cross-eyed, which is where the weakness, also the external eye muscles, the eye muscles on one side tend to be a bit weaker. So we tend to focus, use, or just one eye more. So to remember this term, strabismus sounds a bit like when people are affected with strabismus, one eye might tend to stray inappropriately to other people's business. Okay? Stray business. And one of the treatments is actually to often try to mask the good eye, the eye that people tend to rely on. So they rely on their other eye, and over time that can actually strengthen those muscles. Okay. So that's all I wanted to say about the accessory structures of the eye. Now let's focus on the actual eyeball itself. Okay, the actual eye. So we often think of the eyeball as containing 3 very separate layers. We've got this outer layer, sort of right at the outside of the eyeball, called the fibrous layer, which I'll describe in a moment. And then just inside is the vascular layer, which is a layer that provides the blood flow. And then there's the inner layer, which primarily is the retina. And then within the eye is the fluid, it's usually sort of gel fluid called humors, which I'll clarify. And the inside of the eye also, we often segment into the front and the back, or the anterior and the posterior. It's basically divided by the lens. So anything in front of the lens is called the anterior segment, and anything behind the lens is called the posterior segment. And I'll show you a picture of all this in a moment, just to clarify. Okay. So here's basically the eye, and you can see there's this outer layer here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. This outer sort of white-grey layer, we call it the sclera, Okay, so it's the outer layer of the eye, it's like a fibre. And then the cornea is also the outer layer as well. I can just see a comment. The picture is still loading. Okay, so it's taking a bit long to load. Okay, so look, I'll hope to talk it through and let's see how we go. Okay. Okay. And so what you have is this outer layer, which is the sclera, and the cornea is also an outer fibrous layer. And then you also have what we call, just inside that is the choroid, which is a vascular layer. It's basically the layer that contains the blood vessels, the vessels that supply the eye. Okay, it's this choroid here, this sort of in a pink layer. And then inside that is essentially the retina, which we'll describe in quite a lot of detail soon. You can see that right at the back of the retina, sort of at the center here, is what we call the macula lutea. We'll talk more about that later. But that's basically the area where there's a lot of tone, which can examine or vision very precisely, quite precisely, the macula lutea, and provides very high resolution vision. Okay. And the way we remember that is we think of Macs, as in the computer Macs, tend to have very high resolution, just like this macular region has high resolution, allows us to see very precisely. And right at the center of this mac is we call the fovea, which is an area which is just cones, and that'll make more sense later. And then, and I'll clarify all this later, but all the nerves from the retina then exit through this area here called the optic nerve. Okay? I'm only mentioning this now because I'm going to discuss it in a little bit more detail later. And you can see, and I'll discuss it later, here is the lens of the eye, and everything in the front is the anterior segment, and everything behind is that posterior segment. And most of everything else I have is just little information about the lens, the ciliary body, ciliary resonule, about controlling the lens, and all of that will make sense later. Okay. So let me talk about the three layers in a little bit more depth. So that outer layer is just a fibrous layer, it's just fibre. It doesn't contain blood vessels. We call it avascular, meaning no blood vessels. And it includes the sclera and cornea, as I mentioned before. Whereas the vascular layer is mainly the choroid, okay? It's pigmented. Also, the ciliary body and iris are also vascularized. Those contain blood vessels, so they're often considered part of this layer. And I'll clarify what these two structures are later. Okay. This is just another picture, pretty much of what we had before, but a photograph. So I won't describe it in too much detail. Okay, so then I thought I'd just talk about the movement of the iris and the pupil. So the pupil is just the black area. It's not a structure itself, it's just space, okay? And surrounded by essentially this muscle that opens and closes this pupil. So in particular, there are two muscles. One called the sphincter pupillae, which contracts the pupil, makes it smaller, and the dilato pupillae that sort of opens the muscle, or essentially opens and makes the pupil larger. So in a sense, sympathetic nervous system, which you should know, tends to actually create a sense of flight and fight reaction, and therefore it contracts the dilator pupil, that ultimately sort of pushes this muscle out. I don't know if you can see my hands here. It essentially pushes the muscle out like this as it contracts. So the contraction actually pushes the muscle out and then actually dilates the pupil, allowing us to see more, which is necessary during a flight and fight situation when we're under threat. When we're not under threat, the parasympathetic nervous system then will constrict like this sort of inner muscle that actually contracts the pupil, reducing the amount of light in our eyes. Okay? And the iris is just this outer pigmented section of our eye, which basically gives our eye colour. Interestingly, I should say, in some animals, the pupil is actually not circular. So, for example, in goats, the pupil is horizontal, whereas in some cats, the pupil is vertical, it runs straight. And that basically affects our vision. So, for example, with goats, they sort of often want to be able to see the peripherally. Well, in fact, many animals do, to be able to avoid prey. whereas cats want to be able to focus better, and apparently the vertical slits somehow allow them to do that. I should also mention that whenever we're interested in something, our pupils also tend to dilate. Okay. And so the final layer, so we mentioned the outer layer, the fibrous sclera, then the next layer, the choroid, and the inner layer is basically the retina. Okay. And the retina is actually an outgrowth of the brain and comprises two basic layers itself. Sort of the outer pigmented layer, which just gives it structure, and the inner neural layer, which is where all of the processing actually takes place. And that'll be the focus when we discuss the retina later. So just to clarify how it all looks, you've got the light will sort of move into the eye, pass through the pupil, past, which I didn't mention before, the light can only sort of travel through the pupil and is absorbed by the muscles around the pupil. And then eventually keeps going, and I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but then eventually goes through to the neural layer of the retina. This activates nerves, and these nerves then send impulses through this optic nerve here. Okay. All right. So let me clarify a little bit about the neural layer of the retina. Okay. In fact, I might sort of just go back. So I should mention that the retina contains about 250 million rods and cones, which we collectively call photoreceptors. So just going back to this slide here, right at the end here are these sort of what we call photoreceptors, which are the rods and cones which actually respond to the light. Okay? They sort of change their behaviour according to light and therefore allow us to see. And you can see though that they will eventually send impulses to a whole series of other cells, which I'll describe later, and then ultimately through this sort of nerve here. And at this point, of course, there is actually no rods and cones, so we can't see at that point. And we sometimes call this the optic blind spot. And you might think, well, if we have an optic blind spot, why don't we see little sort of black shapes? Why, we don't seem to notice any sort of little black spots. Well, the reason for that is simply that both of our two eyes don't quite look at the same spot. So where there's a black spot in one eye, there isn't in the other eye. So our brain can sort of fill in the details, so we don't see a black spot. But if we didn't have that function, we'd actually see a black spot, the spot at which the eye doesn't see it, the spot at which there are no rods and cones, photoreceptors. All right, so let me quickly differentiate rods and cones. So, as I mentioned, these rods and photoreceptors comprise rods and cones. And the rods, which I'll describe more later, they respond more to very dim light. So they can even pick up light from stars. And they also respond more to information in our periphery. So it's sort of designed to assess whether there's sort of a bit of a change in our environment, whether we're, for example, going to be attacked by a saber-toothed tiger in our periphery, on our side. And there's a lot more rods than cones. There's about 20 times more rods than there are cones. But they don't provide very sharp vision, and I'll talk about why later. And they're more at the periphery of our retina than at the centre. Whereas cones are relevant for being able for us to see very high resolution. So we can differentiate very small differences in line and also to be able to see colour. But they only respond more to brighter light. And we've sort of described the difference between the macula and the fovea before, so I won't talk about that now. But essentially we always try to move our eyes so that the centre of what we're looking at basically impinges or converges on our fovea, which I'll describe and also in a bit more detail later. Let me just put on a fan, it's getting a bit hot in here. Okay, and so this slide here, if you can see it, provides a little bit more information on the retina. Okay, so essentially, and it doesn't make it clear, but essentially the light comes in from here. So imagine that this is the back of the eye on the right-hand side, and the light is coming in from the left-hand side. Okay? And there are actually several layers of cells, which I'll differentiate now. So, and this is by the way, the neural part of the retina. So right at the back is our photoreceptors. And that might surprise you. A lot of people used to think that the photoreceptors, the rods and cones, you think would be at the front of the retina, because they're the ones that are responding to the light. But actually, and somewhat surprisingly, they're actually at the back of the retina. So in other words, light has to sort of pass all these other types of cells, which are called ganglion cells, bipolar cells, and so forth, before they reach the rods and cones at the back. That's true of most of the areas, except around the fovea. Interestingly, around the fovea, these other cells are sort of like pushed out. I don't know if you can see my hands here, but it's probably not helping much, but they're sort of pushed aside. So that at the fovea, there aren't any of these other cells in front of the rods and cones. The light can almost directly penetrate into the rods and cones. And that's important because if that wasn't the case, if there were all these cells in front of the rods and cones, these cells could slightly shift the light, and so we wouldn't be able to see quite as precisely at the fovea. Okay. And so essentially you have these rods and cones here. And briefly, I'll describe in more detail. Briefly, once they're activated, they send information to the next layer, which we call the bipolar cells. And then they'll activate the final layer, the ganglion cells. When you think of ganglion cells, these are actually large cells that then send information to the brain. It's like ganglia, something to be ganglia is quite large and long, and the ganglion cells are also long. So essentially, in essence, although I'll describe in more detail later, the light will penetrate these layers, it hit the rods and cones, it will activate the rods and cones in various ways, and they'll send information through graded potential to the bipolar cells, so it will affect the activation of these bipolar cells, which will affect the activation of what we call the ganglion cells, and these cells actually go directly to the brain. Okay. And this is a photomicrograph of pretty much the same information. Okay. I should mention here there are other types of cells too, horizontal and amacrine cells, that provide a little bit more clarity of vision, but I won't talk too much about them, at least not today. I should briefly just talk about the vascularization of the retina. So the retina, or at least the outer third, the photoreceptors, are more supplied by the choroid, right? So that's that vascular second layer within the eye. Whereas the central artery and brain supply the inner two-thirds, not the photoreceptors, but the other part of the retina. And here's a picture of that information that probably won't make a hell of a lot of sense, so I'll skim through that if that's okay. Just thought I'd talk about a couple of problems before we discuss exactly how the retina works and how the iris works and so forth. There's a problem that often occurs called retinal detachment, where the pigmented layer and the neural layer of the retina actually detach. And so consequently, that jelly-like substance within the eye, in this case called the vitreous humor, sort of sits between these layers that can actually create some damage and ultimately increase the likelihood of blindness. And people sort of experience that as almost like a curtain being drawn across the eye, or spots and flashes and so forth, demanding laser surgery to reattach. Okay. This slide just talks about something else I haven't discussed, which is a little bit about the formation of the aqueous humor. So I mentioned before that there is an anterior portion of the eye, the front part of the eye, just in front of the lens, and then behind the lens is the posterior segment. And the humor, or that is the liquid or this jelly-like substance within the eye, is called the aqueous humor at the front. And you can remember that because aqueous is a bit like anterior being front, right? And the vitreous humor at the back, in the posterior segment. The aqueous humor actually keeps reforming and replenishing over time, and this slide basically specifies that. So essentially what will happen is that that humor actually flows from the posterior part, from the part through these sort of capillaries, through these what we call ciliary processes, which is a little fibrous layer, which I'm going to talk more in detail, and then enters into the front part here, the aqueous humor, and then is actually reabsorbed through what's called the scleral venous sinus here, which is part of a network called the trabecular network. But basically, the notion is, the important part is the aqueous humor is sort of produced, continually produced, and then reabsorbed. And the reason that's relevant is that sometimes there's actually a blockage and that aqueous humor isn't reabsorbed properly. And so you sort of get this increasing volume of aqueous humor. And it creates a lot of pressure in the eye. So you're getting all this
aqueous humour filling up here, and it's not being filtered properly through the trabecular meshwork, and therefore creates pressure on the eye. And that pressure can actually damage the optic nerve, right, where the neurons exit from the retina to the brain. And that damage to the optic nerve can increase blindness. There are other causes of damage to the optic nerve, but the main one is this increasing pressure within the eye. And one way we can detect that is by actually directing a puff of air at the cornea and measuring how much the cornea sort of deforms. Because if there's very strong pressure, it almost doesn't deform at all. And that suggests there might be too much pressure at the front of the eye here. And therefore, if there's too much pressure, that could be a predictor, an indicator that the person soon will get glaucoma, that damage of the optic nerve. And so because it sort of predicts this damage, doctors often recommend that actually the pressure of the eye is actually examined fairly regularly, maybe yearly or maybe every few years, even after the age of 40, just to prevent and therefore respond to the possibility of glaucoma. And if people do receive glaucoma, there are eye drops that are designed to facilitate the drainage of the aqueous humour, or to reduce the production of the aqueous humour. And there's also therapy, laser and surgery as a possibility. So let me also just now talk about the structure of the lens itself. So we've briefly looked at the lens. Let me just go to another picture of the lens. So here you've got this lens here. We'll talk about its function later. And it's connected to these sort of like fibres we call the ciliary zonule, right? They're little ligaments or fibres. It's now connected to this sort of ciliary muscle here. Okay? All right. So let me clarify all of that now. So the lens is biconvex, and we'll talk about what we mean by convex. It just means that it bulges in a particular way. It's transparent, so that light can travel through it. It's flexible in the sense it changes its shape, and it's actually avascular. There's no blood flow to the lens itself. It's limited blood flow. And it changes shape, and it's designed to focus light on the retina. And we'll clarify exactly how it does that later. The lens itself, right, comprises epithelium at the front, and then these sort of fibres, these long sort of fibre cells, which is the bulk of the lens. And these fibres contain a protein called crystalline, which we'll describe later. And the important part about this is these fibres actually grow throughout life, and they actually become denser. And because they become denser, they don't shift their shape as well. And because they don't shift the shape as well, it means that as we age, the lens becomes less effective over time. And the lens is important for sort of shifting our focus from distant to close vision, which I'll clarify later. And so that capacity diminishes with age. We can't quickly shift our focus from looking at something far away to looking at something close by and vice versa as we age. One of the major problems with the lens that also tends to increase with aging is what we call cataracts. And cataracts are basically a clouding of the lens as the crystalline proteins within the lens start to sort of form clumps. And this problem is increased by not only aging but also diabetes, smoking, and sunlight, or it can be congenital. To some degree, cataracts can be protected by vitamin C. I've written here that vitamin C increases cataract formation. Everything about that sentence is true, apart from the word increases. It should be decreases. So vitamin C can actually protect us against cataracts. And if we experience cataracts, then there are sort of surgical replacements or artificial lens that we can utilize instead. One way I try to remember the word cataracts is it sounds like cat traps. And for some reason, I sort of imagine a cat walking over like a glass table, creating these little traps. You can see all these little traps of where the cat has scrambled over a glass table. And as a consequence of that, the glass table is now clouded with the sort of the dust or the leavings or the remnant of the cat. Okay, that's not particularly good mnemonic, but that could help anyway. Okay, and here's actually a photograph of a cataract where the lens is quite cloudy. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about the anatomy of the eye. We'll now move on to the actual processing of the eye. I won't get through all of that now. I'll probably finish that more tomorrow, but I'll begin that now. So I'm going to open another file, and this is called the vision file. Let me sort of get to the top here. So let me just get rid of this file. Get to the top of this file, and I want you to tell me if you can see it. So hopefully you can see now. Let's make this larger. Oh, actually, sorry. Okay. So hopefully now you can see another PDF with the title Special Sensors Focusing on and Light. If you can't see that, can you give me a message or scream incredibly loudly? Okay, great, you can see it, fantastic. And so I'll talk about that now. Okay, I won't get through all of this particular PDF. I'll finish that tomorrow instead. Okay, so we're now going to talk more about how the eye sort of focuses light onto the retina, and then how the retina actually generates impulses to the brain. That would be the main focus of this particular PDF. But before we do, we should clarify what we're actually seeing. What are we seeing? So what we're actually seeing is light. So what is light? I mean, you obviously know what light is, but what is it from a physical viewpoint? Well, you might want to think of light as like little packets of energy called photons. That in a way travel, we call like in a wave-like fashion, very high speed. Now we know that actually what light is, whether it's a particle, whether it's a wave, it's a very complex physics issue, which we're not going to discuss in detail, but just think of it as little packets of energy that sort of travel in little waves, up and down like this, in little waves. And the length of those waves, between sort of the two peaks of a wave, are called the wavelength. And we only see light at particular wavelengths if it's between 400 and 700 nanometers. Okay, so it won't be like that, it's tiny. So a nanometer is actually a billionth of a meter, right? So we're only seeing light that where the difference between the peaks and troughs is between 400 and 700 nanometers. So just to clarify that, we'll have lots of light moving or lots of, at some very different wavelengths. Sometimes the wavelengths are huge. All right, they're actually meters long, and as in say microwaves and radio waves. Sometimes the wavelength, that is the difference between each peak, is absolutely tiny, as in gamma rays, whereas what we see, and if you can see the cursor here, is just around this sort of white gap here. That's all we can see, only light at that level. Okay. Now we know that when light passes through a spectrum, it creates a rainbow. You know, we see different colours. We see red, rosy viv, so the red, yellow, green, and so forth. And red has the longest wavelength of the light that we can see, and sort of a bit lower in energy. And violet has the shortest wavelengths that we can see. Now what we see, and this is to be precise, is not just the object. So we don't just see a chair or a wall. What we're seeing is the light that's being reflected from that object. And in particular, we're seeing all the light that's not being absorbed by that object. So for example, with grass actually absorbs most light, right? Most light just is absorbed into the grass, except the green light. Green light is reflected back, right? So the light passes through, and then the green light is reflected back, and that's why we see grass as green. Okay? Whereas with some objects, like a wall, like a white wall, all of the light tends to be reflected back rather than absorbed. So we see like all different colours, which makes the sense of white. Whereas for black objects, okay, all the light is absorbed. None of the light is reflected off, so we don't see any colour. So how do we see colour? Well, something I'll clarify later is that our cones, right, our photoreceptors, actually can be divided into three types. So we roughly refer to it as blue cones, green cones, and red cones. So blue, green, and red cones. And essentially, each different cone absorbs light at a different wavelength. So if the wavelength is about 420 nanometers, so it's a very, very small wavelength, then the blue cones will tend to absorb that light and respond to that light and generate a whole lot of action potentials and so forth. If the light is, say, more of like a greeny colour, then the blue cones will seldom absorb that light, or might just absorb a very small amount. But the green cones will absorb a lot of that light and respond to it. Okay? And the red cones will only absorb a little bit. Where if the light is more, say, red light, then only the red cones will absorb any, and even they will only absorb a bit. So that's what this basic graph is about. And so every colour we see is just a combination of those cones. So for example, it might be that if the colour is actually blue, right, if it's like really blue around here, then we know that because it's both our blue cones that are activated and our green cones that are activated, right? Because blue will actually activate these two cones. Whereas if the light is actually, say, red, then we'll know that because only the red cones will be activated. The green and blue cones won't be activated. They won't absorb light at all. So that's how our brain sort of identifies what the colours basically are. But before we clarify how those cones absorb light, I want to talk a little bit about more the angling or the lens. How the lens actually focuses light onto the retina, which is very important. Okay. And to understand exactly how the lens focuses light on the retina, okay, on the part that actually absorbs the light, you need to understand the concept of refraction. Okay. So refraction is basically the bending of light rays. Okay, just bending light rays. That's because whenever the speed of light changes, it actually bends. Right, and this occurs essentially. We often think of the speed of light as a constant. Oh, it's very fast. Light, and some of you probably could even specify the exact speed of light. But actually, the speed of light varies. It varies depending on the medium in which it's travelling through. So when it travels through air, it's very, very fast. When it travels through, say, water, it's a bit slower. It's still fast, but a bit slower. Okay. And as it changes speed, it actually literally bends. And the lens of the eye will actually bend the light because it's convex. And convex means that it's thicker in the centre than at the edges. A bit like, I don't know if you can see my hands like that. Where concave is the opposite, which is not what the lens looks like. Just to give you a sense of how this refraction works, here is a picture that you might often see if you're looking at a straw. And you might have noticed a straw looks like this. Now the straw doesn't actually stop. So it looks like that you've got this, hang on, I'll use the cursor. It looks like the straw is sort of going down here and then suddenly stops and changes direction. But of course the straw isn't doing that at all. What's actually happening here is that there's been a refraction. It's hard to explain, but essentially if you can look at the straw above the water, that would be just the light is just basically coming out at sort of at no angle. Whereas when the light is coming out of the water, as it's will suddenly change its angle when it leaves the water because now it's at a different speed from the water to not the water. And therefore it'll actually bend up. So it looks like, from our perspective, it looks like the light is coming from a different spot. Even though the light of the straw is actually coming from here, above the straw, because of the bend, we think the light is actually coming from here. And that gives us this visual illusion. It's hard to explain, but you might have an intuition about how that works. Okay. So the aim of the lens is to sort of bend light towards the retina. Okay. Let me show you sort of how, these sort of give some sense of how it does that. Actually, these pictures aren't particularly useful. I'll give you some better examples later about how it works. All right. So I'll focus on this slide, focusing light on the retina. So essentially, just imagine the light. So the light is coming from an object like a chair, and then it enters the eye. It begins at the cornea, right? And then it travels through the aqueous humor, like the jelly-like substance at the front, then the lens, then the vitreous humor, the jelly-like substance at the back of the eye, and then to the retina, eventually to the actual rods and cones. It actually bends at 3 points. It primarily bends at the cornea. We'll talk about why it needs to bend soon, but just trust me at this stage that most of the bend is at the cornea, okay, right at the front of the eye. But then it also bends we're entering the lens, and to some extent when leaving the lens as well. So why do we need the lens? Well, the problem is the cornea always bends the light at the same angle. Whereas, as you'll see later, occasionally we need to be able to bend the light at different angles, depending on whether we're looking at a far object or a close object. And I'll clarify this soon. So the lens actually can change its shape depending on whether we're looking at a far object or a close object, and I'll clarify the mechanism of that later. So firstly, before I clarify sort of why that works, I sort of thought I'd just clarify how the lens changes shape. Okay. And it's a little bit complicated, but I think it'll make sense. So essentially what will happen is there's this sort of muscle around the lens. You can imagine there's a sort of circular muscle around the lens. Okay. And when it contracts, you know, let me see if that's right. Yeah, when it contracts, it actually sort of goes inwards. Right? So when it contracts, it sort of, you can imagine it sort of goes closer, this muscle around. And therefore, these little fibers around the lens actually sort of loosen, they relax, right? Because they're not pulling as hard between the lens and these muscles. And that allows the lens to sort of bulge, all right? So essentially, when the ciliary muscle contracts, the lens sort of bulges like this. All right, and I'll clarify that in a second. So essentially what will happen is, if we're looking far away, right, say about 20 feet away, then we actually don't need the lens to bend the light at all. The cornea bends the light to the exact spot on the retina. Okay, and I'll show you that with a picture in a moment. So at that point, the ciliary muscles are relaxed, and so because of that, they sort of become larger. And that pulls on these little fibers, it actually flattens the lens. And when the lens is flat, it doesn't bend the light very much. I think here's an example of that. All right, so in this case, the lens is quite flat. And so because of that, you can sort of see light coming from the top of the eye, will travel to the eye. I don't know if you can sort of follow this with my cursor. It travels to the eye, and then it bends as soon as it reaches the cornea. But it doesn't bend at all when it reaches the lens, and it basically then hits a very specific spot on the retina. And let me also travel to the bottom. So light coming from the bottom of the eye also travels towards the eye. It then bends as it hits the cornea. It doesn't bend as it hits the lens because the lens is quite flat. And then hits the retina at a particular point. Let's assume that's where the retina actually is. You'll also notice something strange, which is that the image of the eye on the retina is upside down. And so, actually, and that's always the case. The objects in our eyes are always sort of upside down in this way. And so you might think, well, why don't we see everything is upside down? Right? If the image on our retina is indeed upside down. Well, essentially, the brain learns that the image is upside down and takes that into account. It says, oh, look, the image is upside down in the eye, but we know it's always that way. So in our brain, we just see it in the opposite way. It looks upside down, so therefore it's not upside down. Just to clarify that, there's a study where an experimenter decided to use a lens that makes the image always the right way up. So instead of the eye being upside down, it was the right way up. And initially, after using this particular lens, the whole world looked like it was upside down to the person. But then, after a few, I think, weeks or months, actually the world looked normal again. It didn't look like upside down. It was like the brain learned. It learned, oh, hang on, now everything is not upside down in the retina, so we need to take that into account, and it can sort of work out, you know, what everything actually looks like. Okay. So now let's think about what happens when we're looking at something very close. So when we're looking at an object that's sort of less than 20 feet away, less than 6 meters away, okay, our eyes, so the light has to actually bend. And in fact, there are 3 changes that our eyes undergo when we shift from looking at something far away to something very close to us, like a book. So firstly, the lens actually changes its shape and sort of bulges. Okay? And I'll talk about what effect that has in a moment. And there's a point where it can't bulge anymore. If we're looking closer and closer, the lens can't bulge anymore, and so we can't see closer than about, say, 10 centimeters. Interestingly, also, this capacity of our cells to change the shape of the lens actually diminishes with age. As we get older, the lens can't straighten and bulge very well, so we can't shift from close vision to distant vision very well either. And this problem we call presbyopia, and it basically refers to the lens being inflexible. And the way to remember that is to think of presbyopia sounds a bit like a president, and presidents, particularly the current US president, is very inflexible. Okay. But in addition, when we're looking at close to something, also other changes in our eye occur. So for example, our pupils tend to constrict, so less light can penetrate the eye. And that's because it's not as easy to bend light that's very far away. So we only want to look at a very sort of small focus, and that's why the pupils contract. And that contraction is mediated by the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the opposite to what normally happens. It's what normally happens when we want to focus. Whereas it's the sympathetic nervous system that actually dilates the pupils when we're sort of in a flight situation. In addition, actually our muscles also shift the eyes too, because when we're looking at something close, we sort of want the eyes to converge, the muscles to shift at the same point. So the muscles also work when we're focusing on something close. So let me show you what that will look like. Okay? So when we look at something close, the light will emanate from the object. It then bends at the cornea. But you can see it also sort of bends again in some ways at the lens. And that allows the light to sort of focus on the retina. If it didn't focus properly, what would happen is that the relative distance between all the areas would change. If it sort of didn't focus properly, then the distance between this top and bottom point of the eye would be different here, and everything would look a bit blurry. Okay, that wasn't a very good explanation, but you might get some sense. Now, if the eyeball is not a classic shape, then we actually struggle to focus some objects particularly well. So, for example, if the eyeball is too actually long, and I'll show you an example of that later, then our eyes and our lens tends to focus sort of at the front, but in the front of the retina, or sort of too close. And so the consequence of that, we can't see things that are very far away. We can only see things that are quite close, called nearsightedness. So our sight is good when objects are nearby, but not far away, sometimes called nearsightedness or myopia. It's corrected by a convex lens that sort of makes sure that the light travels out a little bit first before being focused. Where some people experience what's called hyperopia, which we call farsightedness, where they can only see just far away, they can see that very well, but everything close to them looks a bit blurry. And that's usually because the eyeball is too short. And so the focal point is actually behind the retina. So it sort of focuses behind the retina. This is not a problem for far away objects because they don't need to focus as much. And that's corrected by a convex lens. Whereas astigmatism means that the curvature is a bit unequal. So sometimes the focus is too close, sometimes too far away, and you need more complex procedures, such as potentially laser procedures, to correct this particular problem. So this is sort of an example of a myopic eye, where you can see that the eyeball's too long, so the light seems to focus, right, to be focused before the retina, not at the retina, creating some problems. And that needs to be redressed by first this convex lens that refracts the light out, and so it tends to focus right at the retina. And it's the opposite for a hyperopic eye. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about the lens. Probably the more important topic is around the photoreceptors. We've only got a few minutes to go, so I won't talk about that in detail now and focus on that more later. But let me begin anyway. Okay. All right, so let's talk about these rods and cones in a bit more detail. They actually sort of have you can think of them as almost four little parts themselves. They have this little outer segment, a little nodule on the outer side, which is where the actual pigments are that absorb light, which I'll clarify. Then there's this other little bulge called the inner segment, which I'll clarify later. And then next is the cell body itself, which contains the nucleus. And finally, there's the actual synaptic terminal. So let me show you what that looks like. So that sounded very complex, but not too bad. So you have this little, so this is an example of a particular rod, and you have this outer segment, this little area at the bottom here, which is actually where the pigments are that absorb light. And that's connected to like an inner segment here, which is actually where the mitochondria are that energize the cell. And there's a fiber, an outer fiber, that links that to the actual cell body, where the nucleus is, that's linked to the actual synapse itself, that then speaks to or sends information to the next row of cells. So it's quite a complex structure. Right. Just as an interesting aside, these photoreceptors, the rods and cones, are often damaged. They're particularly damaged by very intense light, or if there's any detachment of the retina as well. Fortunately, they can be renewed. Or at least the outer segment is often renewed, where the actual photoreceptors are, or where the actual sort of pigments, I should say, are. And so every 24 hours, every day or so, this outer segment sort of fragments off and is phagocytized. That is, it's taken up by the immune system and renewed. Okay, so what are the differences between the rods and cones? I've described the basic shape of these rods and cones, but what's the difference function? I mentioned it briefly before, but I'll clarify it later, and then that'll be the end of this particular lecture. In fact, no, it might be easy if I actually begin tomorrow's lecture with the difference between the rods and cones, and then we'll move on from there. So, were there any questions? You're welcome to ask them now. We've still got a couple of minutes left. Otherwise, feel free to email me. So my name is simon.moss@cdu.edu.au. But otherwise, I will provide this 2 more hours of this particular lecture tomorrow, and then a tutorial a couple of days later. So have a good day until then. Thank you.